Well, welcome to the Climate Stewards of Greater Annapolis, our speaker series. We're hoping that maybe some more people will trickle in that might be over at the Bike Riding Rally, but we'll go ahead and get started here to see if anybody else is coming over. So we're the Climate Stewards of Greater Annapolis. We put on events like this every month to talk about issues on climate. And we also welcome you. We also usually have a film night, although I don't think we know what our next film is.
We don't know yet.
All right, so I won't announce what our next film is. We don't know what our next film
To be
is.
decided very soon.
And on the second Thursday, we have our business meeting, so you're always welcome to, in this room too, so you're always welcome to join us then. So tonight we're going to talk about carbon pricing, and I see some of the CCL folks here too, but with the idea that we might not get too far at the federal level right now, we're going to talk about carbon pricing at the state level, and we're happy to have Climate XChange here, who's a group out of who's been working at this hard in Massachusetts and is now bringing it down into other states in the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative area, which we're in. So we'd like to welcome Phil Jacobsberg to talk about carbon pricing on the local level from Climate XChange.
Thanks. So I also have Pete Smith here. He's part of our leadership team. So just a little background, because I'm still learning the background of Climate XChange myself. It started in Massachusetts 3-4 years ago, just a few people who decided that carbon pricing was a good idea. These are people that have been involved, some of them have been involved with CCL, they understand it, and they were trying to push it at the state level. And had some very interested senators, Senator Barrett up there, and then had some interested House people. So I think they have now 3 bills in Massachusetts, 1 in the Senate and 2 in the House, all a little bit different. The latest that we've heard is that I think it's on the Senate side, Pete, correct me if I'm wrong on this, that they're crafting an omnibus bill there, where they're bringing in all this different climate legislation. Whether carbon pricing, the way we're asking for it, is going to be the main push in that bill. I'm not sure. I don't think we know yet. So our founder, Jessica Langerman, was one of those 3 people that started Climate XChange, and she moved down to Maryland about 1.5 years ago. And she started a CCL chapter. For those of you who don't know CCL, it's Citizens Climate Lobby. She started that in Chevy Chase, Maryland. Got a big chapter going. I mean, I went to one of their first meeting for myself was about 1 year ago, and I was pretty impressed with activity going on there. But Jessica really, her heart in many ways is at state work. So she started Climate XChange down in Maryland. Here, and so Climate XChange in Massachusetts got enough funding. They were able to raise enough funding that they have an executive director, they have a communications director, and they got a couple other staff, I believe. So they are continuing to reach out, and part of what their mission is not only to try to get carbon pricing passed in Massachusetts, but also to work at the regional level, as Carl was saying. So kind of on the coattails of Reggie, and I'll talk a little bit about that as we move on. So Jessica got us going down here, and I got involved with her probably about in May last year, and as did Pete. And we were lucky that we found a sponsor last summer for a bill. And then all fall, we were working hard on getting that bill crafted to a place where everybody found to be acceptable. And that bill just got dropped about 1.5 weeks ago. Maybe 2 weeks ago, and we're set up for a hearing, so we'll talk a little bit about that too. So I think this kind of says it all in a nutshell. Climate change is a result of the greatest market failure the world has ever seen, by Nicholas Stern, former World Bank chief economist. What it's saying there is that we've not accounted for the cost of carbon. Right, and it just hasn't been done, and we're still struggling to get it done. So what I want to do is I want to kind of slowly work my way up to our bill. right? And I want to talk about a little bit what's going on in Maryland, talk a little bit about regulation versus unit pricing here as a term that I'm going to use. So with regulation, it sets a quantity, right? And then people end up paying a given price for complying with that, right? So that's what RPS does, right? It sets a quantity of what we're trying to hit for. Where pricing sets a price, right, which will reduce emissions to a given quantity, right? In the case of carbon pricing, we're talking about emission, right? And ideally, they're going to end up at the same place. So when you ask an economist, they'll say theoretically, and I'm not an economist, by the way, I'm an engineer. So this is just what I've come to understand. If you ask an economist, they'll say, they will end up theoretically at the same place. But in the real world, regulations are better at targeting the exact amount of emissions, but the problem is it can be very pricey. And that's why you'll find politically conservatives, Republicans in general, really don't like regulations. I mean, look what's happening with the Clean Power Plant, right? They hate them because it's suddenly a lot of cost to the business. So where unit pricing is better at ensuring cost options for reducing emissions, but may need to be adjusted to deal with the quantity, because that the beef on using pricing, or putting a price on carbon or whatever you're going to do like that, is that you may not get to the quantity that you want, right? But there are ways to deal with that. So the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, they basically have written reports that say, well, you know what, you need both. And we're here to say that we're not, we feel that all of these methods are needed and they're complementary. So we're not saying that you price carbon at the exclusion of doing regulation. Absolutely not. We support the new RPS bill, and we'll talk a little bit about that. So what's going on in Maryland? So in Maryland we have regulations. So the Renewable Portfolio Standard is one. It covers the electricity sector only, and there's law right now. Many of you probably already know this, that 25% of electricity needs to come from renewable power sources by 2020. Okay, and so we're working on that. And then in process, and when I say in process, I mean that it might pass this legislative session. They want to up it to 50% of electricity from renewable power sources by 2030. Now, what we know from working with the environmental groups in Maryland is that there's something called the Maryland Climate Coalition. Some of you might be familiar with that, where all the environmental groups who are concerned about climate change try to work together and try to get behind a certain piece of legislation. Well, they've gotten behind this renewable portfolio standard change of 50% by 2030. And I think it's called the Clean Jobs Initiative. You put jobs in there and people like it much better. Anyway, okay, so then there's the Maryland Clean Cars Program. That's also regulation. It's basically adopted the California Low Emission Vehicle Standards. And there's been a couple levels of standards. And I guess we adopted the level 2 standards in 2007 and then the level 3 standards now in 2012. And they're looking at that having a significant impact on greenhouse gas emissions by 2025 of bringing them down 34%. I'm not sure it's 34% from what. I wasn't able to find that, but 34%, let's just leave it at that. Okay. And then we also have emissions carbon pricing in Maryland. Right, so we have the regulations, but we also have some pricing, and that's where RGGI comes in. So it's a Northeast regional cap and trade system. So for, I don't know all the details about cap and trade, but the idea is that you're putting a cap on emissions, and you're gradually bringing that cap down, and that companies then can buy and sell, what are they called? Credits? Credits? Yeah, thank you. Buy and sell credits depending on whether they're below the cap or above the cap, and that's where the market system kicks in, right? And I think, generally speaking, most of the states, I guess, are happy with RGGI. I think when you talk to the politicians, they felt that it's been working well, and that cap is going to continue to come down to 2.5% a year, and then 3% a year after 2020. And finally, we have an energy efficiency program called Empower Maryland, which is just about making our houses and our businesses more energy efficient. and insulation and all kinds of other programs like that. So it's all good, right? Well, there's something else out there, a mandate in Maryland called the Greenhouse Gas Emissions Reduction Act. And it's the first cut on that was that we had to be 25% reduction below 2006 levels by 2020. That was the 2009 law. Okay, and we're actually very much on target to do that. But then in 2016, they upped to 40% reduction from 2006 emission levels by 2030. The final plan for getting that done is due at the end of 2019. The Maryland Climate Commission meets regularly. I think it's once a month. We have people in our group that attend those. They have a mitigation working group, and they're doing presentations and talking about what the status is. Where are they in this progression to get that 40%? So here's a graph that came out of a recent, I think it was mid last year, of their one of their status reports that came out of the Maryland Climate Commission. And this is modeling that was done by a consulting group from California. I forget the name of the group. I didn't write it down, unfortunately. That modeled what kind of where we're at. So if you look at let me see if I can get my plan here. So you can see that this red line shows that we're on target for 25% reduction in emissions. But then the line starts to flatten out. And if you look where we are, 40%, well, we're short probably about 8 million, what is it? Metric million, right. Million tons of CO2. So, and this is just one simulation, right? So if you were to run it with different other assumptions, you would get different results. So what we've read is it's actually somewhere between 6 and 18 million metric tons of CO2 emissions that we're short. That's the gap that we're looking at. Now, this graph, my understanding is it does include all the regulations that we talked about. So there's some interesting things here, like what you see is then it starts to go up, which is a little alarming, right? And I think one of the reasons you might see it go up is you look where it starts to head up, and that's around 2032, 34. Well, that's when I think they're supposed to mothball Calvert Cliffs. And we can right now get 40% of our nuclear energy, sorry, 40% of our electric energy from nuclear energy. That's from Calvert Cliffs. So that's probably why it's taking an uptick like that. And then also around 2025 is when the Maryland Clean Cars regulation, at 2025 it stops. Now I don't know what the when you say that, I don't know what that means. It goes till 2025, and I'm not sure what happens to it at that point. But you see it flattens out there, and I'm not sure how much of that is due to emissions from cars. But the point here, the overarching point, is that we're not on target at this time. So if we have a look at this, this is 2014 greenhouse gas emissions by sector. Okay, so this is from 2014. It came from the Maryland Climate Commission's latest report. And you'll see that electricity use is 36%. So why is it so low? Well, part of that is because we don't have greenhouse gas emissions from nuclear power. So that 40% of electricity we're getting is not included in this graph, right? So this is really mostly coal, and the rest of it is other sources of electricity, like natural gas. But then you look over here, and this does include the Maryland plan, right, as up to 2014 for Maryland Clean Cars Initiative. And you see that if you add up the transportation on-road and you add non-road, which would be airplanes, you're up to 36%. And then RCI is basically heating of residential and commercial and industrial, so or energy that's used there. So the Empower plan is probably addressing the RCI. You have RGGI and you have the RPS that are addressing our electricity use, and right now you have the Maryland Clean Car Plan addressing transportation. But as you can see from that other graph, right, we're not going to make it. Okay, so I'm going to switch gears here and talk a little historically about where carbon fee and dividend comes from. Okay, so way back when in the late 1800s, England had a problem, and I suspect that same problem was in the United States too, where these steam engine locomotives would pass through small towns and farmers' fields, and they had a lot of burnt embers that would come out of the smokestack or come out of the locomotive, and they would end up in the field, and they would end up on the roofs of houses, and things would burn down. And also, the farmers couldn't do their work because they were all putting out fires all the time. So the railroads weren't responsive to the people, right? The people, the farmers and all that were complaining about it. The railroads told them to take a hike. What they did, by the way, oops, I lost mine. Hold on. Here it is. In economic terms, they call this, by the way, negative externality. So the idea is that now you're taking your cost, that you should be incurring, and you're basically pushing it outside of your organization. You're putting it on someone else and not taking responsibility for it. So this guy came along. His name is Arthur Pigou. He was an economist. And he said, well, we can do something about this. What we can do is we can have the government basically measure what the railroads are doing, measure the damage that they're doing, and charge them for it. Collect that money, right? And then we can take that money and we can return it to the people that are being hurt by it. And I think, and this is my little tiny knowledge of history, and sort of invented this term revenue neutral, meaning that the government doesn't take any of that money. It goes in and it comes back out to the people that it was affecting. So what does that do? Well, that externality, negative externality, causes the government to collect this cash over here, right? And then those funds, as I said, would compensate the people. But it also then puts pressure to motivate the railroads toward remediation, right? It's costing them a lot of money. And the government is measuring, each railroad individually and saying, how much damage they're doing, right? So if the railroad then brings down the amount of damage that they're doing, right, then they're saving themselves money. So the idea here is to apply the same principles to carbon pollution. So the state puts a fee on all fossil fuels in proportion to how much carbon dioxide pollution they release when burned, right? So the idea here is now the fossil fuel companies, and I don't like to demonize them, I realize that, I look at it as we're all complicit, we use their product. But the fossil fuel companies have been polluting our air with CO2 for a long time and haven't been incurring any cost for that, right? So that's the negative externality. So the idea is you collect that money and you return it to the public and use it for programs to reduce pollution. So what does that look like in that same chart? Well, there's your externality up here. Here's your money that gets collected. Your funds come back to the families. Your funds come back to the businesses. And it motivates the fossil fuel companies to change their energy platform because it's a competitive environment. And we see that these days, right? With your electricity bill right now, you can pick where you want your electricity to come from. It's a competitive environment. So suddenly, if fossil fuels go up higher, they become more expensive. It's in the interest of those companies to say, well, we want to be competitive and we're going to switch to more renewable supply and renewable energy. Now, it also, if you think about it, going back to the example of Pigou and the railroad there, it actually was also in the interest of the farmers, right, to maybe use GMO crops that were burn resistant, right? Because then they would get this money that was essentially free money to them. right? Because they were getting a cut of that money, even though they weren't being burned. That's the case also with applying this to the fossil fuel companies, right? So the families and businesses over here are going to get a cut of money no matter what, okay? And we'll talk about that in a little bit. They're going to get a cut of that money. So if they are spending more money because they are using fossil fuels more, if they have, you know, a large SUV, or if they're if they haven't installed solar panels and they're using all kinds of natural gas, whatever, to heat their house or whatever, then essentially they can reduce their own costs by moving to energy efficient. So it works on both sides. It creates a motivation factor both for the businesses and for the users. So why carbon pricing? The price of a product should include the damage to society that it causes, harm to health and the environment, right? Because that's the negative externality. So raising the price gives consumers incentive to shift, as we just talked about, to energy efficiency and clean energy, and producers to supply more clean energy instead of fossil fuels. Fuel users have a choice, though, which this is important, of whether to pay fee or cut emissions and how to cut them more flexible than regulations. So basically, you're leaving it up to people to say, okay, I'm not ready this year to put solar panels. I would rather pay for the fossil fuel. Is that a good thing? Well, you know, it depends where you look at it, but it gives people and businesses flexibility to do what they need to do to adjust to the new situation, right? So some people would say, hey, regulation forces you to go quickly. And actually, in some ways, in the environment that we're in with climate change, I'm a believer in that at some level. But politically, it doesn't roll very well. Okay. Almost all economists believe that carbon pricing is the most cost-effective way to slash emissions. Okay. So now let's talk about our bill. It's called RICI. Sounds a little like Reggie. It's a real mouthful. It's the Regional Carbon Cost Collection Initiative. So the idea is that we're collecting the cost of carbon, right? So that's, and Ben Kramer, one of our sponsors, came up with that name, and we all filed in right behind him. We thought it was great. David Fraser Hidalgo is our co-sponsor. Ben sits on the Economic Matters Committee. David Fraser Hidalgo sits on the Environment Committee. We introduced this legislation. It's now called HB 939, and our hearing is set for March 5th in the Economic Matters Committee. And if anybody needs something to do that day, we want to pack that room. So after this presentation, if you're at all convinced that this is a reasonable bill, please come out and join us. Okay, so what are the objectives here? The objectives are very simply to make significant reductions in Maryland's CO2 emissions while doing no harm. Okay, so we've seen other bills out there where they have a lot of other sort of programs attached to them, right? And this is a pretty straight ahead bill. This is you can sum up the objectives right there. So what do we mean by do no harm? Well, one, we protect low-income individuals because we know that the way energy is paid for is essentially regressive. Okay, I pay the same thing as someone who makes a heck of a lot less than I do, right? Or someone who makes heck of a lot more than I do is paying the same thing. Okay. Protect vulnerable employers, as employers that are energy intensive or unable to compensate for increased costs. Okay. So the idea is that we don't want to screw the Maryland employers who suddenly wow, you're killing me because I have to compete out of state too. Okay. And change the price of carbon gradually to allow households and businesses time to adjust, right? Some more objectives. Help Maryland achieve its greenhouse gas emissions, the 40 by 30, right? So we looked that we can be big players in that. And I think we're getting noticed, but you know, it takes a little while. And create a green infrastructure fund to support clean energy projects and transition benefits for workers. So some of the money, and we'll talk about the allocations in a moment, is going into an infrastructure fund because we need to continue with energy efficiency projects. We need to support those people that are being pushed out of the fossil fuel industry. We have some transportation needs. So anyway, some of that. And then finally, Maryland can lead the way in the march toward a RGGI-like regional carbon pricing program for the Northeast states. If these Northeast states could get together and do the cap and trade, why can't we do this program? Remember, cap and trade only covers the electricity sector, right? There's no reason you can't cut in something like this and cover everything. So, and there's a lot of interest there. We'll talk about that in a minute. Okay, so let's walk through the bill provisions. Okay, so the bill covers CO2 emissions from transportation, households, commercial and industrial sectors, and by electricity consumed in Maryland. Once again, the whole gamut. Okay, collected at the fee is collected at the first point of sale or transfer within the state. So in the case of gasoline, it would be at the pumps. That's where it'd be collected. Electricity distributors pay based on generating plant contributions. So the distributors, they get electricity coming from all over. They're not going to pay anything for nuclear power coming in, but they will pay considerably for coal, and they will pass it on. And then natural gas suppliers pay extra for escaped methane, okay, because that is a problem with natural gas. And for those of you who don't know, probably most of you know, methane is a really noxious greenhouse gas. Okay, so our plan starts with an initial price of $15 per ton of CO2, per million metric ton of CO2 released, okay? So that's the first year. And then each year, subsequent year, that price goes up a little bit, $5 per year until it hits $45 per ton. I then say then reevaluate prior actually to hitting 45. There's a reevaluation that will be done. And decide if we want the price, decide politically, decide environmentally, if we want the price to keep going up. If we're still not hitting our emissions targets, 40 by 30, or I think 80 by 50 is the next one, right? Then they're probably going to let that price keep going up, which is what I want, but this is what it is right now. So what does that translate into? I didn't mention this earlier because there was something in the slide that I forgot to mention, but so for each $10 of CO2, cost of that, it's a 9-cent rise in gasoline. So by the time you hit $45 per ton, you're talking about a 40-cent rise in gasoline. So that's why, to me, it needs to continue up. Right?
Is it per gallon?
Yes, per gallon. Sorry. Rebate allocation. Okay. 10% to the Green Infrastructure Fund. That's what we just talked about a moment ago. So that's taken right off the top. And we're talking about a lot of money here that comes in through this program. You take that money, you take it right off the top, you give it to the Green Infrastructure Fund. And then you have 90% of the money left over. Then you take that and you divide it into the households and into the employers. 75% goes back to the households, 25% goes back to employers. And other provisions, other greenhouse gases may incur a fee at the discretion of the Secretary of the Environment. Okay. Now, the way rebates work is that each adult in a household gets a cut. So if there's 2 adults, you get a cut, 2 pieces of the pie, if you like. And what I mean by that is you take the pot of money that's collected, so that 75%, right? Actually, it ends up being more like 67, 75%, and 90%. But anyway, you take that pot of money, and then you divide it equally by all the adults that live in the households of Maryland. And everybody gets the same cut. If you're a dependent in that house, you get half a cut. So the key to those of you that are not familiar with carbon fee and dividend, you're not getting the money that you put into the system. In other words, I filled up, I put this much gas in my car and I paid this much of the fee, right? Or I use this much natural gas to heat my home, I pay that much of the fee. That doesn't matter. You're just going into the big pot and then you get a cut. Now here's the thing, is that you will make out with your rebate more than the money that you put in if you go ahead and you start moving from fossil fuels to green energy. Right?
So now everybody gets a rebate whether you contribute to the carbon emissions or not.
That's right. That's right. So if you didn't contribute a thing, If you have a completely green house and green life, you're going to get a cut. Because everybody should be like you. That's the idea. All right. So now, how we protect low-income people? I'll show you a graph in a moment about about how the essentially the rebates break down. We've done some modeling of this. But we know that we want to make sure the highest probability that we protect the lower income people, because once again, they're not really treated in many ways fairly. So we take that 75% of the money, right? We get that bucket there. We take 25% of it off, and then we move that down into the lower income quintile. So if you split the income population of people up 5 ways, you go from lowest to highest, right? The lowest 2 quintiles get 10% of that, and the middle quintile gets 5% of that. And it basically is a little bit on the backs of the 2 highest quintiles, the people that have the money. Yeah, go ahead.
This is not going to require any additional administration other than applying provisions in the tax code, right? That's how it will be administered?
No.
In other words, you're not going to create an administration that's got to write checks to each individual family.
Oh, yeah, we are.
Okay.
Yeah, so it's not, no, there are different ways. Well, hold on, I'm going to ask you to hold questions to the end, okay? Because otherwise we won't get through this. But yeah, please hold them. But just let me answer that. We've calculated that about 5% of the total fees will be required to do administration. It is possible to do this via taxes, right, to return. And it's been looked at with CCL and other, and I think there are other, like, I think British Columbia, if I'm right, I think they return it via taxes. So there are other methods to do it. But like CCL's come to the conclusion that that's not always an equitable way to do it. So anyway, that's our point of view is to return checks. And there's a couple of reasons behind that. But I'll get to them in a moment. Another provision. So employers redistributed, the employer's money is redistributed to protect trade-sensitive industries and vulnerable industries. So like agriculture is somewhat sensitive. Small nonprofits, right? Because they can't lower their costs. They're going to be hit by higher costs for heating and whatever they use, fossil fuel energy they use. Government agencies are energy-intensive manufacturers. So the idea is to try to protect them at some level so they can continue to compete. Otherwise, they will oppose this. They'll be like, wait a minute, I'm getting screwed by this. Rebates to employers after that are based on number of full-time employees. So essentially, it's just divided. Each employee in a company gets a certain small rebate for the company. And then this is an important one. Electricity suppliers deduct payments already made in support of RGGI. So the idea is that electricity suppliers don't get feed or taxed twice, right? They get once for RGGI, that gets deducted, and then they get the rest. The rest of the fee is for this plan, Ricky. We'll look at that a little bit closer in a minute. Another bill provision is Maryland won't do this on itself. Well, that's what our sponsor said, okay? Maryland is not a state that likes to get out front on these kind of progressive issues. They like to, I think we are an excellent second place team. So what the decision was that if there are 2 adjoining states or 2 other RGGI states that pass legislation like this, then, and I don't think it has to be carbon fee dividend. I think it can be cap and trade. It just has to be a market-based system. That we would go ahead and then it would turn on our bill. So even if it got passed, at this moment, it would sit on a shelf until that happened. But there's a lot of things happening right now regionally, so we think no matter what, it's going to happen soon. Green Infrastructure Fund allocation, we give 50% of the money to the states and then 50% to local governments. And once again, what we use it for is transportation, emissions reductions, climate change resiliency, energy efficiency, work or transitional assistance, those kinds of items. And then finally, there's an additional rebate for households dependent on fossil fuel, or I'm sorry, on fuel oil, as opposed to natural gas. Right? Because once again, they are going to be kind of additionally priced, where they're gonna feel like, well, wait a minute, just because I'm on fuel oil, and that's gonna probably affect a lot more rural people than it will urban people. So it's kind of a rural protection too. So here's some of the strengths of our bill. It's politically viable because it's a market-based system. Once again, Republicans know, conservatives know, even the ones that come out denying climate, that this is all coming, that we have to go here. We have to put a price on carbon, or we have to do something about our carbon emissions. And so when it comes down to would I rather have regulations or would I rather have a market-based system, it's an easy call. And that's why at the federal level, you see that there's a lot of significant Republicans that have gotten behind something like CCL. It's called the Climate Leadership Council. We'll get to that in a moment. Natural expansion of RGGI. So RGGI covers the electricity sector. As I mentioned before, RICI covers the remainder plus the electricity sector. Okay, so RICI actually enhances RGGI. So RGGI right now is about $5 a ton of CO2 emissions, right? Where RICI actually starts at a price that's 3 times higher than that. So it's much more effective in the electricity sector. And then it goes up to a price that's going to be 10 times that in 7 years. Now RGGI will keep going up too. But it just gives you an idea that we come into electricity fairly hard. I could see we come into transportation lighter, but that's where it is right now. We're 90% revenue neutral. That's important, okay? Because if you're 100% revenue neutral, nobody can say that you are quote unquote a tax, right? Because you're not. They can, but they shouldn't. If you're 90%, you're pretty damn close to 100%, right? So that 10% once again goes in that green infrastructure fund. So we're not revenue neutral now, we're revenue positive. Okay. And once again, the strength is it gradually moves households, employers, and utilities off fossil fuel dependence. It hits everybody. So here's some numbers to look at. So these are the impacts on households by quintiles. So once again, you have all the way here on the left, you have the bottom fifth, the lowest income quintiles, and over here you have the highest fifth. And so when you look at the fees charged, it's kind of interesting. It's the blue bar. You see that it increases almost as linearly as you go up from the bottom to the top. What that says is that people in the bottom quintiles typically use less fossil fuel energy, less energy in general, than people in the highest. Why? Well, they usually don't have as many cars, or they might drive less. They have smaller homes. They don't fly as much, right? So their fossil fuel usage. Now, is that everybody? No. It's like any statistical distribution. It's probably a nice standard distribution. But CCL at the federal level, and I'll get to that in a moment, they depend on that. Okay. So let's keep going here then. The rebate, though, if you look at it, is pretty high for the low-income areas. The 2 quintiles at the bottom have the highest rebates. That's the orange bar here. And then the rebates go down a little bit, and then they go up at the very end here. And so the gray bar is probably the most important one. The gray bar is the difference between the fees that people are going to pay over time and the rebates. And so you see that and this is annually, right? So you see that people in the low-income area, in general, once again, on average, are going to make somewhere around $150 for the year, where people in the highest fifth bracket are going to be, I think it's about $40 in the minus. Those aren't tremendous numbers, but you're still protecting the low income. So the idea, once again, the objective, decrease CO2 emissions, but do no harm. So we're not trying to make people rich. We're not trying to create a new social program. We're just trying to protect people who could be vulnerable. So this gets to the taxing idea. Humans like to get checks in the mail. They just do. And politicians like to put their names on those checks, right? And so it could be it's likely to be a very popular program. Mike Tidwell from XChange has said about the DC program, when those people start getting the checks, they're never going to give them. And I think that's an excellent thought. I mean, this is where sort of the logic between maybe using taxes or using checks might, may not hold up real well, but then there's the human element, right? Now, the thing is also about those checks is they will help stimulate the local economy. People will spend them, okay? And so how that's done is this is a graph from Massachusetts. There was a lot of study done in Massachusetts. Our studies here are still on a little bit the lighter side. But cutting fossil fuel dependence means less money flows out of the state. So the idea here is that we pay a lot of money to bring fossil fuels into the state. Like all of our gasoline, it doesn't come from inside Maryland. We do have coal in Maryland. In Massachusetts, they had like no energy comes from, I think, in the state, or very little. So that money is flowing out of the state, right? If you change that by reducing fossil fuel usage, right, that money stays in the state. So your gross state product goes up, right? Once again, this is Massachusetts, so take these numbers with a grain of salt, which you see here, but it will happen in Maryland too. Okay. And so here's a regional outlook. Over here on the right, I have just, these are the Reggie states. And I think New Jersey's about to join. Yay. So here's what's going on, just quickly. Revenue positive bills. Maryland's been dropped. Massachusetts, as I mentioned, I think they've got at least one, maybe two revenue positive. New York has a bunch of, at least one bill. Connecticut has a revenue neutral bill. Massachusetts has a revenue neutral bill. That's a Senate bill. Rhode Island, Vermont. And I don't know how many of you know what's going on in Washington, D.C. So Washington, D.C. has a revenue neutral bill. And Washington, D.C. bill, according to Mike Tidwell, XChange, he thinks it's going to pass this year. They've created a large coalition. And even Exelon has gotten behind it. So Washington, D.C. could really be the breakthrough place in the United States. It's actually pretty exciting, and I think it's in some ways like the best kept secret around. Because a lot of people I've talked to don't know. I didn't know until fairly recently. Now their bill is a little different than some others. They actually don't put a tax on gasoline. Don't collect fees on gasoline. But what they do instead is they do it on parking, which is actually quite clever when you think about it, right? So, there's not a lot of driving that goes on in DC, right? And there's enough, but anyway, those people would just go over the line and buy their gas there. It's not far, right? But, if they come and park their car and you put a fee on that, it's a pretty cool idea. Okay, so working on it, New Hampshire, they're working on this idea, and New Jersey. New Jersey is really cool. We were contacted by a bunch of Princeton undergrads who've been working on this for like about a year now. And they showed us their PowerPoints, they showed us their white paper, which I still haven't gotten through. It's amazing what they put together. And they're on their way right now to getting a sponsor in the legislature in New Jersey. So New Jersey's going to be there. These kids have done a great job. If you want to get status updates on these various states, then here's you just go to Climate Exchange. You go to our website, and there's a in the menuing system there. You can see each state, what its bills are and what its status is. So finally, I just want to talk a little bit about Citizens Climate Lobby. Some of you are chapter members, great. I'm also, I didn't mention this at the beginning, I'm sorry, I should give a little bit about myself. So I am, last year in March, I attended Climate Reality Project training, that's Al Gore's group. And then shortly after that, I came back and we started a chapter of Citizens Climate Lobby in Silver Spring. I got to know Jessica. I became very intrigued with working on this at the state level. But really, Citizens Climate Lobby is about doing this at the national level. And there's, hands down, that's what we want. A bunch of states doing this differently at the state level is better than nothing. And it's actually a lot better than nothing. But If we could get it done nationally, that would be better. That's what Citizen Climate Lobby's been working on for the last 10 years. So a little bit about them. So 2017 was their 10th year anniversary. They deserve credit for creating a Climate Solutions Caucus. So it was a Citizens Climate Lobby person, a business person, who went and got this whole thing started. The Climate Solutions Caucus, if for those of you that don't know, is up to 70 members. It's in the House. It's exactly what it's called, a Climate Solutions Caucus. But it's evenly divided between Democrats and Republicans. So if you're a Democrat, you want to sit on the Climate Solutions Caucus, you have to bring in a Republican, and that's a challenge. But the thing is, it's grown. From last year at this time, I think there may have been like 10 members, something like that. Small number, to 70 now, right? 35 Democrats, 35 Republicans. And CCL has played a large role in that. So in the United States, there's over 400 chapters. The idea is to have a chapter in every congressional district, right? So that because Citizens Climate Lobby is exactly what it says. It's a lobbying organization. And twice a year, we have a lobbying conference in DC in the summer and then again in November, where we hit every congressional representative, every senator, and we lobby them. And people come from all over the country to do this. And what's most important is the constituents come, right? So like if I show up in Arkansas's, one of Arkansas's congressional district's office, they don't care that much, right? But if someone from their district comes, it's huge, right? You get credibility, you know. So I've ridden on a little bit of coattails there. CCL has gone international. There's big presence in Australia and Canada and then some other countries. You know, scattered chapters in other countries. So their legislation, what they're proposing is start at $15 a ton and increase $10 per ton, different than ours. Ours is increasing $5 with no limit. They haven't put any limit, just let it go, let it ride. They're 100% revenue neutral, meaning that all the money goes back to the households. And this is where their claim is low-income people are protected because, as I showed you in that graph, they tend to have a lower profile in carbon emissions and in fossil fuel usage. Whether this proposal stands and actually would make it through legislation, I don't know. But I think they're smart to hold the line here because anything else they do will be complicated, right? I mean, we're feeling complicated. And all these parties come up and they're trying to pull you in different directions, right? So they're smart to just keep it simple and hold the line. And they've done some modeling. But last thing I want to talk about in this slide is border adjustment. So the idea here is that if you're dealing with the country, if you're importing goods from another country that doesn't have an equivalent program, there's going to be a tariff against them. So if Spain, for instance, we're importing goods from Spain, and they have no kind of carbon taxing program, then we're going to tax their stuff. Why? Well, it's fair, but it keeps our businesses here. Otherwise, where are they going to go? Move to Spain. Right? So they did some modeling with the Regional Economic Modeling Institute. After 10 years, they say there's going to be a 33% reduction of CO2 emissions below 1990 levels, and after 20 years, 50% reductions. That's what their models showed them. And actually, also 2.8 million jobs would be added to the economy. I didn't put CCL's website. They're easy to find. Just go to CCL on the web. But if you want to go look at all their modeling results, you can look at the whole modeling report, or you can look at a summary. I mean, it's all there. So the last thing I want to say is kind of a bit more of a statement. It's a little bit of a statement of let's not make the good the enemy of the perfect. So the way I look at this is, you know, we are environmentalists, yes. I expect that probably most of the people in this room are environmentalists at some level, right? But climate change is like no other problem humans have ever faced. I think a lot of people would agree with that. So many of us are climate hawks now. And there's an organization called Climate Hawks, and that's not what I mean. And when I talk about we, I'm talking about people in our organization, I'm talking about people in this room, I'm talking about lots of people who have decided that this is the highest priority issue right? So we will win. And when I say we, I mean everybody here. And I'm not talking about our bill. I'm talking about we have to win, right? Why? We have to win because we have to, right? We have to win. So thanks for listening. That's all I've got.
Thank you.
So I guess we're going to do a little questions now.
Yeah, that'd be great.
So I would like to invite Pete up. Why don't you come on up here? So, you know, every organization has a guy that, you know, he's the guy that reads all the reports. He's the guy that reads all the legislation from the other states. He's the guy that sits on all the calls that are regional calls, you know. Well, Pete's that guy in our organization. So I like to have him. You know, it's nice to have him here and, you know, help with some of the heavy lifting.
Maybe you could address that one question that was raised about checks, because that's comes up all the time.
And the imposition of another administration.
Yes, exactly. Well, the Maryland requires any laws that comes through to be before, when it's actually first presented, has to have an analysis of the cost to the government. That's a requirement on everything that comes through the House of Delegates and the Senate. There's an exception now, which is if the bill actually is going through, raises money itself and can pay for its own administration, then they don't have to do it because it's not going to cost the government anything. So when we're talking about raising money for Ricky, it's $1.2 billion in the first year. It's a lot of money. And they've done an analysis on how much that will cost. How much out of that money will have to go to administration. And it's 5%. The Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative costs 6.5%. It also raises money, so it's not costing the government that, because it's raising money. Last year, Reggie raised $50 million for the state of Maryland. And that was after the 6.5% was taken out. Now, with respect to sending checks out, one of the amazing things about Maryland, this is definitely not true in most states, as far as I know, is they have an extremely well-developed data collection system. So they can tell you how many households there are in Maryland, how many people are in every household in Maryland, and it's up to date all the time. They already have the number of households for 2017 published, which I think is how they do that, I don't know. So the idea of sending checks out to households is a matter of tapping into that database, because all you need to know is how many households and how many people are in those households. And that's what makes the administrative part of it as inexpensive as it is.
I'm skeptical, but because that implies a pretty perfect database. And we know there's a lot of imperfection in the counting.
There's a lot of potential for corruption. That's true. And so you have to build in things like that. And people worry about that. So I think we all will, actually.
Right.
On CCL, you said that in 2007, when they started it, they were recommending $15 a ton plus $10 every year. And if, so by 2017, they'd be up at about $100 a ton. Were they right in 2007? Or should they have raised it so the way they originally proposed it?
When you say were they right, what do you mean by right?
Well, because because if their bill had been introduced in 2007,
Yes.
by now the price would be up at $100 a ton.
Right.
But they, rather than say this is what it needed to be, they said, oh, the year you bring it in, do it at 10. So we'll only be charging, and 15. We'll only be charging 15 now if they introduced it today. If they'd introduced in 2000, it'd be 100. There's a big difference,
Oh, I
and
see.
which of those two numbers is right?
Yeah. Well, I mean, I guess it depends what you decide your climate goals are, right?
Well, I'd like to survive.
we have climate goals in Maryland, and they're pretty specific. I don't know that we have them nationally, right? So I think what the way CCL looks at it is that we want to get the program started as quickly as possible. And we know that if we go in right now and say, well, it's immediately going to start at $100 a ton, it's going to be dead on arrival. So I think it's a little bit relative to just kind of what we can do politically.
Well, it's the other thing. What is really needed?
Yeah.
And if they were right in 2007,
Yes.
then it needs to be 100. And in
Yeah.
fact, if you say how much does it cost to take a ton of carbon out of the atmosphere, it's over $100 a ton of carbon dioxide.
Yeah, and you know, I certainly wouldn't. I'm not defending keeping it low. I'm all about doing whatever we need to do at this point to bring this problem under some level of control. So I agree with you, but I don't know that it would go anywhere, especially in today's world. There's still not a complete acceptance. I mean, really, there's not an urgency, right? There's an urgency in some places, but that's what we're missing, right? And so I think it's building that urgency first before you can get those kind of numbers passed.
Well, there's the question, what is really required?
Yeah.
Because saying that it's not politically acceptable, if we're going to have a catastrophe without doing it.
Yeah. Go ahead.
To answer, I have a question, but to comment on that gentleman's point, I think a real choice may be between $15 a ton and $0 a ton. So I'd rather get 15 and get that passed and have $0 a ton. We couldn't get $100 a ton passed. So I think it's as you said, a case of don't make it perfect, even make it good. My question is about doing it at the state level. So on the map you showed, you said it looks like Delaware may have some kind of proposal. But the two biggest borders that Maryland has are Pennsylvania and Virginia, essentially.
Yeah.
And neither one of those states has a proposal. So how does that work from the, one of the things CCL likes to talk about is border adjustment.
Yeah.
I don't see how you do border adjustment at the state level. And I don't see how you make it work without border adjustment.
Yeah. And you don't do a border adjustment.
So
At
why,
least
why would I not move my business to Pennsylvania or Virginia to avoid these costs?
Yeah, that's a good question. Well, first of all, it might end up following you, right? It's a big expense to move a business, and that's why you're trying to protect the more vulnerable business. You're probably better off just moving to more efficient energy, right? Or more cost-efficient energy, and then you won't have to move. And as far as, I mean, it's called leakage, right? Well, that's one of the, I guess, the economic term for it.
But I just think leakage is huge if you do it at the state level. For example, personally, I don't drive that often because 9 days out of 10 I telecommute. But the 10th day I drive to Virginia. So I'm just going to always fill my car in Virginia if it's 45 cents a gallon more expensive in Maryland. So, I mean, I'm going to take the dividend and I'm going to buy the gas in Virginia and I'll be fine. But that does nothing for the environment.
Well, this is where our traffic situations in this area work in our favor.
Yeah.
Most people won't do that. But actually, it does raise this question. Pete, do you recall in Mark's research in Massachusetts, they looked at this, but I don't recall, you know, because they came to the conclusion that it was the leakage issue was not enough to be concerned with not moving ahead of this with a bill like this. But I don't remember what
I don't think
leakage.
it was as severe there as it is compared with Virginia. I mean, Virginia's got a very low tax base on their tax rate on their fuel. And a lot of people do go to Virginia. But Massachusetts, they had some leakage and they worried about it some, but it never came up to be more than 2 or 3 or 4%. So they just decided it wasn't something they would try to cure. Virginia, by the way, is rapidly moving towards joining the Renewable Greenhouse Gas Initiative. So I think that well before this year is out, they will already be in alignment with the other states on that. And the next step then for us is to go to Virginia and convince them that they have to have something on carbon pricing too.
Yeah, Reggie doesn't have the same leakage effects because I have to buy my electricity in Maryland if my house is in Maryland. That's not a choice, but I can buy my gas in Virginia, so.
But
I-
I would
I-
never
I
do
think
that.
just
Personally,
because-
I would never do that because I could never get to Virginia. I mean, I'm just looking at my commute, right?
Yeah.
I never get to Virginia in any kind of efficient way. Now, there's a lot of people that probably could, so but let me say that we're working on various studies right now, okay? We have our household impact study ready to come out in the next couple of weeks, right? What we need to do then is look at an employer study, an industry study. We haven't done that in Maryland yet, so we don't have great answers to that. We just have what we've seen in Massachusetts. Go ahead.
Questions, and I'll ask them rather than having a conversation like is going on. Following on, what I am Joe, gas station manager. What's keeping me from buying my tanker of gas from Virginia? I don't need an answer now. Second question is about, instead of you driving to Virginia, let me explain. Instead of you driving to Virginia to fill up your tank, I, the action down the street, buy the gas from a Virginia distributor. And then I will sell it to you instead at the 45% increase because of the law, to a 20% increase, and I pocket the other 25. You are happy because compared to the Shell, you're saving 25 cents, but I'm getting 20 cents extra respect to what I pay for the gas. Okay, so what's
Well,
there
it
to
seems
keep?
like the answer to your
That-
first
that-
question, if you bring in a tanker of gas and you're basically not complying with the program, I mean, I would think that would be illegal, right? I mean, there's gotta be a penalty against that.
Why is that not in compliance with the program though, when that you say the price is levied at the pump? So it doesn't
Yeah.
matter where you're getting your gas, the consumer is paying the price at the pump.
But
And that's where the money's coming in for the
the
program.
price of Virginia gas is exactly the same as the price of Maryland gas. It's only the tax that's different. So it's really, that's.
So you're going to collect your carbon fee at each gas station
Yes,
in Maryland?
The cost for the gallon of gas.
yes, that's right.
So,
Not at the refinery, not at the distributor, at the mom and pop gas station?
That's my understanding.
Okay, second question. I'm trying to understand your reasoning about quintiles, especially because I don't understand how you define quintiles. Is a quintiles, let's say that there are 1 million people in Maryland, for sake of argument. Is your lower quintile the 200,000 people who get the least money, irrespective of how much they make? And your lowest quintile, highest quintile, the 200,000 people who make the most, irrespective if they make 100 millions or 1 million, as long as 800,000 people make less than the top quintile? Or is it based on income? How do you find your quintile?
That's a good question.
It's at the ladder, it's based on income. Yeah.
Okay, so how, can you give me an idea where the income levels fall?
The lowest 10% is $16,800.
So we're talking quintiles, so 20%.
So, and I'm trying to think through what the levels are in my head. I don't really remember how they're divided exactly. I should have brought that paper with me because somebody always asks that question. But it's based on the income per 10% or 20%. The 20% I think is 32,000, but I wouldn't bet on that. It's pretty low. And then it ramps up really high when it gets up to the top 20%. Maryland's one of the wealthiest states in the union, and has the fourth worst pollution in the United States. Can you believe that?
But
See
if
it
you
in
go
the
in
sky.
that way, you're very
Air
few
pollution,
people
water
pay. Okay, I promise not to have a conversation.
Well, I had a question about the same graph. Based on the quintiles, it was the second highest that incurred the greatest net cost as opposed to the highest range. And I thought that was a rather curious.
The second highest was the largest fee or the largest rebate?
The largest net,
And I just.
The largest net.
the largest net loss, yeah.
Right, yeah, but they're very close.
They are.
They were within $10.
But considering that my guess is the difference in the income levels for those two is probably substantial, right? So
Right.
that seemed a bit odd to me.
Well, in any of these models, I mean, there are assumptions that are made, right? And I think what happens for a model is that you build some of this raw data that you get from Maryland. Some of it is researched assumptions, and then you let the numbers speak to what they say, right? Now, if we had our economist here, I think he could probably speak to where he could tell you the details of where he thinks that might be coming from.
Well, he actually knows because he explained it to me one time. As I looked at the same thing, I said, how can it go down? I mean, how can this be worse for the second quintile down than the top quintile? And honestly, don't remember why that asymmetry occurs. But, yeah.
On that same graph, why don't all the
Can you pull
quintiles
up
get the
that
same
slide?
rebate?
Please.
Why don't all the quintiles get the same rebate?
Go back one page, the last line explains it.
Yeah, exactly. Because it is slanted, skewed toward the lower
Yeah.
income classes.
Yes, that's right. Because we take 25% of the money that goes back to households and of all that money, and then we skew it or we redistribute it toward the low income side.
Back to the-
But
Yeah, go ahead.
Yes.
But you give the bottom and the second, the first and second the same.
Yeah.
So that shouldn't explain.
They
The
should,
difference,
okay, so
right. I mean, the difference has to be something other than the.
you talking about the difference in the net now? Or are you talking about the difference?
The rebate,
The rebate.
that's
The
a very
rebate.
good point.
So why is the rebate a little bit higher in the second quintile? We're giving them the same amount?
Yes.
Because it's based on usage too.
No.
The
No,
fee
it's not based on
that,
user.
No, it's
well,
not.
the fee that you're paying skews upward because you assume greater usage of
Actually, the
research.
rebate
right,
is
but the
higher
rebate.
for the top quintile than the fourth quintile.
We'll have to ask Mark. That's a good question. That's a very good question. There must be,
Don't know is the quite a.
yeah, I don't know the answer to that, because you're right, you would think they would be the same.
So you had said that, how much did you say you expected to be collected from?
1.2 billion.
1.2 billion. That's good, because that's what I estimated too. So that would be at $15 a ton.
Yes.
So that would mean that there would be a little bit less than 300 million that would be going into the employer rebate account.
The employee.
But depending on how
About
how
20
efficient this
20%
is.
of that, yeah.
Yeah. So
Yeah.
I think
240 million.
yeah.
Okay, 240 million. So
Okay. And that would be, I think that's a big answer to the border adjustment question, because, you know, you've got that, I mean, you're talking about $240 million that's there specifically to compensate businesses that are being hurt by this.
Right. Right, that's what that's for, is to give them incentives to stay.
So how does this actually reduce carbon emissions? I mean, you can't just stop using gas unless you buy an electric car. I mean, a lot of people object to the price of that, that it's all the issues about range. I mean, what are you gonna do? What alternatives you have out there? Drive a smaller car? Well, look, I mean, people that like to drive big trucks, they like to drive big trucks.
There's a cost though associated with doing that, and that's what's implied here.
Well,
You have to pay for that luxury.
Well, what's going to happen is
gonna be that
demand is
clear
going
to
to,
me.
well, it's already happening. The demand is increasing worldwide for either hybrid vehicles or electric vehicles. Like Volkswagen, they're going to, I think they're going to offer an electric vehicle for every vehicle they have by 2030. So all the car manufacturers are moving.
Yeah, I'm not saying that there isn't a general movement in this direction,
Yeah.
but, you know, for every electric vehicle, see, even a gasoline hybrid,
Mhm.
I mean, it's better than a straight gasoline or a straight diesel maybe,
Right.
but from what I've read, carbon emissions are expected to go up. You know,
What do you mean as more people are on the planet and driving?
well, look, I mean, there's all these developing countries, they're gonna want cars.
Yes, and then of course there's that probably more so, yeah.
And they're gonna be less able to afford something that's expensive that doesn't,
But expensive is a relative term, right? It's kind of expensive right now, but that price has been crashing down. Remember, you couldn't get electric cars for, you know, I mean, look, the Chevy Bolt just came out, it's a $35,000 car, and it gets 278 miles. In 5 years, that'll probably be, you know, a $20,000.
well, I remember what happened with the Priuses.
Sorry, 238 miles.
You know, when I first bought a Prius, if you saw one a month on the road, I was, wow, you know. And then like 2004, they're like everywhere, you know, 3 of them are parked next to each other. So
Mhm.
I'm hoping that will happen with electric vehicles.
I mean, it's
a-
happening somewhat
it's
in
a steeper climb though, just because of you don't have the charging stations all over the place.
Well, what you have, by the way, with electric vehicles, if you look at the newer ones now, right, well, something like the Chevy Bolt or, I mean, that's been around for a little while, but a friend of mine, he bought an Audi that does this. It gets like 50 miles on a charge. It's a hybrid, right? So now, I look at a 50 miles on a charge. I could get to work and get back. Never have to use the fossil fuel engine, right? But then I need to go to New York. Now, what's happening is that electric infrastructure is slowly coming in. Unfortunately, the East Coast is slow. Go to the West Coast. I have a friend of mine. He's out there. He's like, 10% of the cars are, you know, electric now. You know, we're just moving slower.
And
Because we're
another
not
question I have is, like, what do you think the reaction from the oil companies is gonna be about this?
What's the reaction?
Yeah, I mean, aren't they gonna start lobbying like crazy? Don't
Well, they already are. I mean, that's, I mean, the dream team of climate deniers, they didn't just come that way because they just woke up some morning and decided, I don't think that I believe in climate change. It's because they are essentially being bought off. So the Scott Pruitts, the, you know, Ryan Zinke's and Rick Perry.
So, I mean, you know, this obviously this bill can't do anything about that, but how does it, you know, how do you win?
Well, in my opinion, we have 2 huge problems. We have this climate change problem, which is right on top of us right now. But then we also have an election reform problem, right? I mean, you look at Citizens United and all that, and to me, I mean, you're hitting on my 2 passions, right? It's both of them. And I would love to spend all my time working on election reform issues because that's really, to me, what drives so much of this lethargy with regard to this subject, right? But at this point, I don't have time to, I mean, especially after this administration got elected, I feel like it's going to be a longer time to get that done. So yeah, I know it's you know, it's hard, and the fossil fuel companies are going to fight us all the way. But in the end, they know the truth.
Well, they knew years ago.
Yeah.
But that doesn't mean that they haven't been able to know so many other people.
But isn't that the point of this legislation? You're trying to influence a more rapid change by forcing a cost on.
Right, so I made this side comment in reaction to what you said about 5 minutes ago, which is that I'm really not convinced that people are gonna get it. Like, they don't realize that they're actually gonna get more money in their household if they burn less gas.
Well, if you keep upping the price, they will get it, right?
Yeah.
That's
Well,
the idea. I mean, the economics drives a lot.
Doesn't that also up the objection to it?
Yeah.
So
Go ahead. Yeah, it's good. It's a good point.
the 2 points I'd say on that are, one, I mean, Exxon's position currently is that they're for carbon price. Not that they're going to do anything about it, but their stated position is carbon price would be good. And the other is, despite the millions of dollars that the fossil fuel industry put into Maryland, we got the ban on fracking, so we can do it here. So that would be my answer to those questions.
I mean,
I
look,
think you have to start somewhere. I
absolutely.
think that's your point.
Yes, absolutely.
You have to start somewhere, and the other thing I was thinking is, you have the increase every year, and that is a law that you're trying to get passed.
Mhm.
But in 2 or 3 years, we could pass another law to make it even more
Right.
in the direction we want to go.
Right.
So this is not the end. This is the beginning.
The most important thing, and it's a great point, the most important thing is that greenhouse gas emissions mandate that we have passed. Because that drives everything, right? If we didn't have that, everybody would be like, no, we're doing fine, right? So now we have a target that we want to hit. Yeah, go ahead.
So I have a suggestion on how you can simplify your distribution back to Maryland residents. Give kids a full share. This idea of kids are disproportionately affected by climate change, not only with respect that they are going to inherit this problem, but also because they're disproportionately impacted by the health impacts. So it's children and it's families of children who bear a greater burden with the climate change impacts. So why have share?
That's a remnant from the Massachusetts bill.
Yeah, they're wrong.
They went through a big argument, well, your point's well taken. They went through a big argument there about whether they should have full share or half a share. And they ended up at half a share. So we just sort of paralleled their bill without giving it a lot of serious thought, I think, to be honest with you. And also because the bill is called a regional bill, and the way the bill comes into effect is if other states actually pass similar legislation. So
it doesn't have to be that similar down to those two.
no, it doesn't actually. And I think these kinds of modifications are going to come about. I mean, these are good arguments.
I also think
Reason
there's
we're here.
arguments on both sides of it. There's arguments that, the two people that are incurring the bills are the income, they're the income generators for the house. So I understand what you're saying. It's just depends on how you look at it. And that was a decision by our bill sponsor. He said, let's make it.
But parents are paying for the asthma medication.
Mm.
They're paying, for the respiratory disorders. They're paying for these things. So yes, they will be getting the rebate, but it's the children who are disproportionately affected by the health.
But also they're going
And they're going to
to pay higher prices later just because, real estate's going to be more expensive because there's not going to be as much of it.
Hmm.
I mean, we live on the water, we're pretty low elevation. I'm personally not that worried about it, like in the next 20 years or so, but, kids now, they probably aren't looking at that 20 years from now either, but they're going to be faced with it.
In order to make a change like that, one would actually have to look at the data and see if that's actually the case. If you can say that that's really the way it occurs, that children are more are equally or more affected by the health, for example, education and so forth, then that's a good argument to change it from half to one. But not having that data, I don't know if they have the data in Massachusetts, but we haven't even discussed that database here, so I don't know what's in it.
Is Citizens for Climate Lobby, do both of your groups, are you primarily targeting carbon pricing? That's your major initiative?
Yes.
That's how, and with all that you both know about climate change, you feel strongly that that's the most important strategic issue of all?
No, I guess.
I mean, balance with what you're saying, the political, like when you wake up every day, like I think every day, like what should I be doing? Sometimes I just turn in circles, but
Oh, I see.
you study this, you're specialist. Or,
No, I think it's a personal decision, really. You know, for me, this program made sense, right? I believe that market-based solutions have a lot of power. I believe when economists argue that to me, and in our group, we have a number of economists.
It's kind of, you're filling an advocacy gap. I mean, there's kind of a whole range of approaches to climate change, and you feel like this is a gap, and you're filling that gap and pushing forward.
Right. Well, because I don't think, we haven't done a good job thus far in tackling, for instance, transportation in the United States or in Maryland. Not as much as we need to do. And I mean, looking at, just to stick with Maryland for a moment, we're doing a good job on the electricity sector, or we're doing a better job. But I completely support RPS, 50% RPS. I even support 100% by 2035 food and water watching bill.
Could you just
And
explain a little bit? You've
one
got
just
3
tag on a
bills.
little bit. On that same note, when you're talking about transportation, I've just recently become more informed about fine particulate matter. Like I'm obsessed about it now. Every time a plane goes over, how close Annapolis is on the freeway. They're building apartments next to the freeway. No one's saying anything about fine particulate matter. Instead, and so I've actually sent letters out to some environmental groups. Of course, I didn't hear anything back about why don't we, that's a great project to scare the hell out of people because they don't know living next to the freeway. They don't know driving on the freeway. Mm-hmm. There's absolute silence. Hogan's talking about noise pollution from the planes, but the apartment I'm moving from, there's there's something that comes down from the planes onto these properties over to schools. Yeah. So Annapolis is kind of a hot spot. I mean, Maryland is, like you said. So that's why I say, like, is there a chance to push forward in these other kind of other realms? Because I know that if more people found out about that, they would be scared.
Well, that's where the Maryland.
Like, we should have it on a freeway. There should be signs saying you're breathing, the left. But that's not fun. That's the truth.
But the Maryland, my understanding is the Maryland Clean Car Program has upped the standards on it.
But we put more cars on it.
Oh.
That's what I mean. So we never get ahead because we got this belief in this population growth is essential in this country, which it isn't for economic development. Right. The Germans don't add population the way we do. There's this bias that we've got to keep adding population. That's another kind of pillar that we need to
so, you raise an interesting point that, and it kind of goes that bigger, you're asking, what do you want to get at? That's the health effects of and probably more people health effects, but all of society, right, or even all species, right, of the health effects of what we've done with fossil fuels, right? And I look at it, so if that's what drives you, then you want to probably aim toward legislation that's probably more working in that area. Personally, that's not what drives me. What drives me is that we are driving our planet into the ground.
Oh, yeah, I'm not talking about the planet, but I'm trying to get away
I should say, I should say.
Because they're not scared.
Yeah.
And if they knew what they were breathing on the freeway to help them drive.
That might help. That might help.
I was wondering if you knew if it was a group.
I mean, it's worked in China at some level, right?
Yeah.
They had such a bad smog problem that they started to up their game about dealing with it because I think they're worried about their population revolting, essentially.
And the lead came out of gasoline just because of what you're saying. The lead levels got so high in the fields next to the highways that it was actually becoming, serious.
There's still this particular people I didn't
So,
know. feel like a fool.
So are you familiar with the Maryland Environmental Health Network?
No.
Because they may be the closest that I'm aware of that would be working on those kinds of issues.
Yeah.
And I can give you contact information.
Thanks.
Am I right that there are 3 bills to be considered this year by the House in Maryland? Yours, and one aiming for 50% by 30 and 100% by 35. Those 3, there are 3? Is it possible, I mean, why haven't you been able to talk amongst yourselves and say, hey, here's one?
Well, okay, that's a good question. First of all, we came a little bit later. The coalition behind the RPS bill, 50% by 2030, has, pretty much set their course a long time ago. And, once again, I don't see us in competition with them. I see us as being complementary to them. I want them to pass, but I want us to pass too, right? And this may not be our year. I think it's much more likely that it's RPS this year. Again, maybe, right? The 100% by 2035, I think that one's it's a political long shot. I think it's a, but once again, I could probably get behind that too. That bill does some other things that I'd have to look at closer. But regardless, I'm a do-it-all mentality these days. I think we need it all. I just think that this approach offers something that other approaches don't offer, so put it on the table. That's why I kind of start out with that regulation versus carbon pricing, right?
There's a big difference between you and the other 2 bills, because you allow nuclear to continue. The others want to wipe it out. So you're way ahead of them.
Yeah, I think that's a mistake. I think it's short-sighted. I understand the problems of nuclear energy. The waste is a real problem, and then of course it's dangerous. But I look at it as a transition technology right now. We have a much bigger problem than worrying about nuclear. But that's my opinion. I realize that other people don't share that. Right.
I can give you an example of the renewable portfolio standard. Wind, for example, most of the wind comes from Virginia and Pennsylvania, even comes as far away as Iowa. And you can sign up to get 100% wind power. That's what I have in my bill.
Many of us do.
Yeah, most of us do, yeah.
And it's what, I pay about 13 cents, but I think you can actually.
It's a little more expensive.
Yeah, so it's a little bit more expensive. And, the utilities, they're under a mandate now to get as much wind power as they can on board. What will drive that? Well, if we put a price on the electricity side, it raises the cost of coal plants up above the price of wind plants, then we're helping the renewable portfolio standard. And we're also pushing towards a much better emission reduction.
And it's even already there's a company called Neighborhood Sun. You guys have heard of that?
Yeah, that's it.
Right, so they're putting out community solar panels in Maryland now, and they're saying that they will underprice Pepco.
They've got 5 projects coming.
Yeah.
2 in Delmarva, 1 in BG&E, and then 2 in Pepco.
Yeah.
And I'm gonna be working for them in March, so they, yeah.
You're going to be working for them?
Yeah.
Oh,
So you can sign up very, very soon.
Yeah, no, it's exciting. I wanted to look at that. Okay.
I just had a question with 100% by 35. Does that include aviation?
No, the RPS bills are all dealing with electricity, retail electricity sales in Maryland. So it's only dealing with electricity that's being sold in Maryland.
Do we have, what was this, House Bill 939, was this one?
That's awesome.
Okay, yeah, and then do we have, I haven't seen the language yet on Sierras and Food and Water Watches, which is the 100% by 2030. Has anybody seen that?
Yeah, there are.
Okay.
Yeah, it's a really
So
bill.
let me follow up on that, and Will. You had mentioned, somewhere near the beginning that the hearing is March 5th at 1 p.m. and for the House and I believe in the House office building. I believe that's the House hearing. So that same hearing is the 100% bill and the 50% bill. They're all.
Not both.
Not
It's
50,
100%.
just 100. Yeah.
My understanding is the 50% is, I think it was the next day, but at least that's, well,
Okay.
that was the latest information that we got from
Right.
our sponsor. Now, he could be wrong,
Okay.
because you're hearing it's all the same day.
Well, no, I was just looking up yeah.
So you're
But
saying
we-
it online, it's showing all the same day?
That's what I wrote down, but I could make a mistake too.
Well, it's funny, because before we went to see our sponsor, that's what I heard.
Okay, well,
Right?
so
And
maybe
then-
it's been changed.
And then he had his administrative assistant look at it,
Okay,
and they said, no, it's the next day.
all right.
So, yes, we're gonna be the same, at least, we're gonna be the same day as the.
Okay, so this one's at 1 o'clock, and I'm sorry, what do we have time or any other? Do you know?
Well, no, but we'll publish that as well. So, any others? I still have questions. I can ask questions all night. But you had mentioned that the half comes from the Massachusetts legislation. I'm just wondering how much of this, how the Maryland organization is working, how much of this is coming from Massachusetts, and how much data we are going to be getting in Maryland. How much resources you have to do that, and to some degree, how we might be able to help them down here. Because if I understand correctly, you don't have staff that you're volunteer like we are, unlike the Massachusetts operation.
Well, so we have an economist in Massachusetts who's actually done a lot of work for the state of Massachusetts in this area. And so he's done a lot of the research for us at this point. So he's created this household impact study. And we might be getting additional help from other organizations. That's kind of a TBD right now. And of course, we're going to need funds to keep Mark Breslow, our economist, going. So he is working, and nobody's asked this, but I'm going to throw it out there because there's an elephant in the room. And the elephant in the room is, well, how much CO2 emissions are you expecting it to go down, right? How in your program, what is the emissions reduction that you're expecting, right? Because I did say it for CCL. That's one of the studies that Mark is working on right now, and we should have that 3 or 4 weeks. Yeah. So I didn't want to mess around with those numbers because I could throw out some numbers from other states and all that, but they're all different. They're all different. Massachusetts was somewhere in the 10%. British Columbia is 10 to 15%. DC is going to be 23% over 14 years. It's also over what span of time, and compared to the emissions of what year are you comparing them to. So DC is 23% reduction over 2019 emissions, right? From 2019 emissions over a 14-year period, and that includes their RPS 50%. So there's a number of variables that you're working with there. So that's one study we're working on. The next one that we really need to do is employment and industry. And it's not clear to me, honestly, yet, who's going to be doing that, whether it's going to be Mark or we're going to try to dish it out to a different organization.
We have 3 professional economists in our volunteer group, too. One of whom is the head economist for the World Resources Institute. And so she works not only on the state bill, but internationally. Quite a lot.
Yeah, you should tell them, what you're working on right now with Joel and.
Yeah, we have a group called the Evidence Group, which is made up of 4 people actually. And what we're doing is we're analyzing the interaction between our bill and Renewable Portfolio Standard and RGGI, and then the state programs with Empower and so forth, to make sure that the way our policies are developed, that we're not going to somehow negatively impact Reggie. We already know that we're gonna positively impact renewable portfolio standard. That's pretty clear. But Reggie is a very complicated program, and there are ways that we could negatively impact them if we don't put the policy correctly. So, and that's a pretty tough economic problem that we're fighting our way through. I think the answer is yes, you can definitely help Reggie with our program. It certainly will increase the amount of emissions that are reduce emissions, but Reggie's an interstate program. There's a lot of states that are involved in it, and they're trading these allowances all the time. And so you could actually have a situation where if we raise the price too high, then the utility group that controls this, which is called PJMs, the internet system that actually controls where all the electricity goes, and finds out where the coal plants are sending their electricity, where the wind plants are sending their electricity. You could actually have a situation where if we raise the price in the wrong way, that you would have a plant in Pennsylvania that's a coal plant, which would suddenly start getting a better price than anybody else. So you'd be buying electricity from a coal plant in Pennsylvania and not eliminating the emissions that you were hoping to. So it's a bit complicated, but the Reggie people are very well organized. Their policies are all really clear, and they're improving all the time. So we've been working with them a lot on how this is going to fit together.
So have they said anything publicly about the legislation?
The Reggie people?
Yeah.
Well, yes, Phil mentioned that there's a commission, it's Maryland, the Maryland Climate Commission, and that's Ben Grumbles heads that, and Ben Grumbles also heads the Reggie program, and several people on that commission have come to us and said that they think that carbon pricing has to be part of their game plan. Ben Grumbles, as far as I know, hasn't said that.
Just a quick, I was looking at this plot. So I think the way this is done, I'm ready to check, is that you're splitting up the income levels into quintiles. They're all fixed, right? But you might have a lot more people in the second quintile than you have in the first. So it's not by number of households, it's by income. So I think that's why you see it different. But once again, I need to, you're asking some good questions, and I'll check with
No, that does not make sense.
No.
If you're dividing it by income, then if you're dividing it by 20% of income, then the bottom fifth would have to get the highest rebate because it would be a lot more people.
Now, this is the rebate per household, I presume, because it's $350. Has to be per household.
What?
Right.
Or
per head.
No, I think it's per head.
Yeah.
Per head, fine.
Right.
I'm happy
Yeah,
with
per
that.
head.
Bottom line, these studies are referenced on your website, right? So we can go look at these studies.
Well,
see
no,
what's
this study is not yet, but it's
No?
because we have not released this to the public.
Okay.
Because we're in the final stage.
Because your previous graph too had open to some interpretation and
Right.
it generates a lot of questions.
No, the
But
report
there's
will
no
be out.
background on that?
The final study will be out in probably less than 2 weeks.
Yeah,
Okay, and you'll publish it then?
Yes.
Okay.
Oh, yeah, no, we're not trying to hide anything. Actually, I had to sort of beg my economist to give me these notes. But, I probably should have looked at them because I got them literally a day ago.
Yeah.
But you're asking some good questions, and we'll have to follow up a little bit.
I'm glad he said that because I hadn't seen that graph before.
Yeah, he's gonna.
What graph was that?
If it is per
Oh,
household,
well, the previous one.
first and second would be the same, The fourth and fifth should be the same, and the third should be the midpoint between those two, the others.
We'll get a detailed.
Based on what you have in this slide. If there's something else playing, it's another story.
Yeah. Dan, you have a question, sure?
Yes. All right, so let's say you bring in $1 million, you take off 5% for administration, 10% for the green initiative.
Yeah.
Of those 850,000 that are left, 75% goes to families and 25% goes to businesses.
Yeah.
But you are protecting the rural people, the people who are depending on oil for heating.
Yes, there is.
There is a lot of but.
Yeah. And look, you're right, and they're judgment calls, and actually some of these are political judgment calls that have been made by our sponsor. That's one of them. You know, it wasn't something that we were pushing from CXC. Our sponsor was concerned that there was going to be a lot of politics, because you know that's what he lives this, right? And he lives, and he is a member of the Economic Matters Committee, so he knows what is going to be challenged. So yeah, you're right. There is some but there.
So besides Hildolfo Fraser, what feedback have you got from the other legislators? I mean, what has he said? What is the take on the appetite for this?
Well, so this session, they're not looking for more co-sponsors. And the reason is because we kind of know that it's not real likely. It's possible, but it's not real likely that this is our year. And I think there's a feeling that if we get a whole bunch of co-sponsors, that it will look like it might be our year, and then we won't have the momentum going into next year legislatively. So if this came out of committee, right, and we hadn't built the coalition yet, which we really haven't, we're just starting that process, right, then we could go down in flames. And then next year it would be hard to start it up again. So the idea, I think, this is you know, my partial understanding of politics of this, is that this is our year really to begin building those coalitions. And actually, it works out well for us because the environmental groups are not getting behind this at the moment. They're all focused on RPS, 50%. And I think we have a little bit of a job convincing them, but I think they've made an agreement with each other. That's really what it comes down to. You know? So I think, you know, so I think that, was there other reasons that Ben was holding off on getting further co-sponsors?
Well, some of the delegates are up for election. And tax is a no-no.
Yeah, that's right.
Some people will classify this as a tax, even though it's rebated back. And so whoever's running against the delegate that supports this, they'll say, oh, it's just another tax bill, he's a big tax person, blah, blah, blah.
Yeah, go ahead.
Yes, it is rebated back, but going back, 5% administration, 10% green initiative.
Right.
At most, you are rebating back 85%. So somebody has to pay for that 85%, for those 15% without getting it back.
Right. The higher
Have you figured out who?
Well, this graph shows it's the
They're not.
top quintile.
That's not enough.
It's not enough.
That's way not enough.
Okay.
I mean, the economic modeling that went into this took that into account, of course. So the amount of money that shifted from the upper quintiles to the lower quintiles is set based on the fact that you only have 85% of the money. In fact, it's less than that because it's 75% of the 90% minus the 5%. Yeah.
But this does not show enough to.
Well, I would say, you know what, probably the best, regarding that level of detail is to wait for the report to come out. It's gonna be out in the next 2 weeks, so, yeah, let's defer to that. I mean, if I had Mark here, he could answer those questions, but that's beyond.
Different questions.
So one of the things that I've gotten out of this, just to put it on our side, is one of the reasons that we come and talk to people is because they bring up things like, why aren't children getting a full one rebate themselves? And there's a good reason. So that's something we'll go back and we'll raise internally and talk about it. And then we'll talk to it with the delegates about it and see what the delegates think. And during the next year, that may change.
Back several pages, you show a pie chart in which approximately the carbon is 25% transportation, 25% electricity, 25%. Yeah, that one. Yeah, okay. I'm off. But roughly is four slices.
Yeah.
One transportation, one is heating, one is electricity, and one is everything else. Yes, roughly.
Okay.
All right. This proposal addresses transportation by taxing gasoline. Yes. And there's electricity.
Well, all fossil fuels, yeah, go ahead.
Right. And addresses heating, because you have provision to protect people who use heating oil. You must tax them in order to give them back.
Agreed.
How about the rest?
Well, that's a good question. It depends what's being done there, right? So if some of this is coming from like an agriculture, some of that could be methane, right, released by cows, for instance, right? In that case, well, that's where there is a provision in the bill where the secretary could decide that there's going to be some kind of fee against that. Right now, there is not. We don't have that. Why are you shaking your head?
Because it expressly, you can put a fee, according to the language in the bill, you can put a fee on anything except methane from a cow. It explicitly excludes farm animals and crops as a.
Okay.
What about all the other animals?
Well, right, just.
So that's where, that's where, and waste management could be incineration, right?
Right.
And incineration is not something that we would be covering. So is it everything? No, not everything shown on this graph.
We have 585 million chickens and turkeys raised in the Delmarva Peninsula every year. And that is an awful lot of stuff to take care of. So if you're talking about some people focusing on different things, there are people that are really focused on that problem. Because that's a huge, huge pollution problem, huge methane source problem.
So he actually put a carbon measurement for cows too.
Yes.
I didn't pick that up.
What about people who own their own trucking company? They're just like one employee. Is there anything?
So that's where the vulnerable employees would come in, right? So if he's a heavily fossil fuel dependent company, right? Then maybe he would get a piece of that.
I mean, because they're
rebate.
You're talking about incentives for people to cut down their use of fossil fuels. Well, Tesla is supposed to be coming out with a full-size truck.
Right.
I don't know how much it'll cost.
And a bus.
But it's supposed to save money in the long run.
Well, the major shift right now, which is underway, and there's a huge debate in the petroleum industry about it, is the big diesel trucks are being converted to compressed natural gas, which makes a huge difference in the pollution that you get from a big truck. And the diesel people are fighting like crazy because of that shift.
Well, when you say the diesel people, you mean the producers? producers or the users?
You just, well, in a refinery, they refine X amount of diesel, right, and X amount of gasoline. So if you suddenly are going to compress natural gas, the refineries will stop producing that much diesel. They'll just lower the quantity, and that puts all those big truck builders that have diesel engines, it's a big shift for them. It's a dramatic shift. They have to go over to compressed natural gas. And now Tesla wants to do, of course, is go one further and shift them over to electric vehicles.
So it's 9 o'clock, so I want to give everybody a chance to, we don't have to cut things off. People are welcome to stay. There's no reason to move, but, but I would like to thank,
Bill and Pete.
It's all right.
for coming down and talking to us about the issue,
Well, you guys